So now we have finally arrived at Heavensward, the first expansion, and apparently where the story starts getting good. At least that's what the general consensus is. Honestly, A Realm Reborn's story was never that bad. It was just bogged down with incessant back and forth and tedious fetch quests that lacked any real substance, etc, etc. Anyone who played it before the revamps will know exactly what I mean. But even ignoring the revamps, the difference in storytelling between the base game and the expansions has always been substantial. This is where the narrative gets a lot more focused, and its better qualities are allowed to shine because of it. However, this also makes its flaws even more apparent, and Heavensward does stumble in a few areas. Those qualities and those flaws are the subject of this video. Be warned, there will be major spoilers here, even more so than last time, as I will be going into much greater detail on the finer aspects of the narrative from this point onwards. Let's begin. There is a certain magic to be found in FF14, in the way each expansion picks up more or less right where the previous story left off, and Heavensward is no exception. There's year-long breaks between each entry, but very little Eorzean time passes, if you will, and everything stays relevant as a result. It gives the narrative something unique and feels rewarding for long-time players as the game revisits plot elements that were once seemingly forgotten. The very first interaction we see sets the tone for Alphinaud moving forward. He suggests going back to Ul'dah to do something about the accusations surrounding the Scions, but Haurchefant asks him not to be hasty and reminds him there is no need to act alone. After a brief pause, Alphinaud agrees and apologizes for his impatience, a sign of growth for the boy as early as this. He has been humbled by what occurred at the end of A Realm Reborn, and the writers make sure to highlight his development repeatedly. He's also rocking a brand new voice. Many of the English cast were replaced for this expansion, and the game is undoubtedly better off for it. We are taken in as wards of House Fortom, one of the 4 high houses of Ishgard, and make our way to the city proper. I like how the game plays an introductory cutscene complete with a narrator for each expansion, setting the stage for the story to unfold. It's a small thing, but I feel it helps give each expansion its own identity, whilst also elevating the presentation to something far more cinematic. Things get much grander in scale and scope from this point onwards, so it's only fitting that the presentation matches that. For Heavensward, the narrator is Count Edmont, who's writing his memoirs, which I think is a nice touch. Stepping into Ishgard for the first time is exciting. So much is made of their isolationist ways and how they shun outsiders and all that, so finally getting to see it in person feels like an event in of itself. It also helps that the Holy See is unlike any other city-state in this game, both aesthetically and structurally. It is a strict theocracy led by the line of Thordan I, with its current leader being Archbishop Thordan VII and his Heavensward, which is the name of his personal guard. In keeping with tradition, there are 12 male knights in this guard. One of my favourite things about Heavensward is how it ties the history of Ishgard directly to the narrative. By the end of the expansion, Ishgard is more developed than any other city-state in this game, and it gives the audience plenty to appreciate. Shadowbringers does something similar with the first, but more so the region of Novrant in general, so it's not quite as concentrated as it is here. Really, the story of Heavensward is the story of Ishgard. But about that history, essentially it goes as such. The first Elizans travelled to Kurthus 1,000 years ago and were set upon by Nidhogg and the Dravanians. Thordan I and his Knights 12 defeated the Great Worm and claimed one of his eyes, which would subsequently be passed down to each preceding Azure Dragoon, but Thordan perished and only 4 of his knights survived. Since then, Nidhogg has waged war against the Ishgardians in a millennia-long conflict known as the Dragonsong War. This specific understanding of the war is a key tenet of Ishgardian faith, underpinning the city's beliefs for 1,000 years. This is important to remember as we are told a couple different interpretations of the Dragonsong War's origins throughout the story, and it's something I'll be coming back to in the conclusion. Now, the 4 noble houses of Ishgard are direct descendants of the 4 surviving Knights 12. Almost all the power in the city is concentrated on the Orthodox Church and the noble houses. The symbol of each house is even present on the city-state's flag. There is a stern divide between highborn and lowborn, with the latter often viewed as nothing more than inferior servants by the former. The divide is so prominent that the city itself is split into two distinct areas, the foundation for the lowborn and the pillars for the highborn. Admittedly, the PlayStation 3 is also partly to blame for this split, including the ones in Limsa, Gridania, and Uldar, but here it is used to further highlight the stratification of Ishgardian society. Just like the other city-states, there is strife within Ishgard, which primarily stems from the societal divide and the Dragonsong War exacerbating that. So anyway, from here we meet with Count Edmond, we're given a tour of the city, and some shenanigans ensue with his two sons, Emanelain and Artoirel. The stuff with Emanelain really has no bearing on anything, so instead we shall look to Artoirel. With him we travel to the Curthis Western Highlands, one of my favourite areas in the game. The place has a sort of melancholic beauty about it, and I love the musical pieces that play here. They are stunning. We are tasked with the expulsion of heretics, those who have pledged allegiance to the Dravanians, which eventually leads us to Lady Iceheart. This is a very brief encounter where she details her meeting with the Great Worm Hraesvelgr, one of Midgardsormr's brood and Nidhogg's brother. Apparently, this experience opened her eyes to the quote-unquote truth and vows to bring about peace between dragon and man. When we remind her that innocents died when she attacked Ishgard, she goes on to lament her crimes, insisting that all she wants to do is see peace restored. This is highly suspect as it contradicts her actions in the previous game. I mean, what exactly did she expect when she assaulted the Steps of Faith with the Dravanians in tow? I hesitate to declare this a retcon or something. It could just be a way of highlighting how tragically misguided her character is. This expansion does serve as a redemption arc of sorts for her, and this seems to be the game's way of setting it up. In fact, this entire opening sequence, until we meet Lady Iceheart again, is setting up the story. When we head back to Ishgard, there's a nice moment from Artoirel where he admits to questioning our competence initially, stating that the rumors surrounding us beggared belief, despite Haurchefant championing every one of them, but after seeing us brave the Western Highlands and take on the heretics, he apologizes for having such doubts. The reason I bring this up is because Heavensward is where the narrative gets a lot more personal for the Warrior of Light. A Realm Reborn was mostly our origin story, and people treated us as such, a lowly, albeit skilled adventurer, but now that we are firmly established, the story has shifted in response to that. It points to a good level of internal consistency within the game world, and promotes a feeling of friendship with the supporting characters, a prime example of which comes up next. We learn that Alphinaud and Tataru have been detained and accused of fomenting heresy by the Heavensward, so they demand a trial by combat, and we stand in as Tataru's champion. This is a moment I like. It feels good to stand up for Tataru, and it also exemplifies how much more personal things are now. Upon defeating the Heavensward, we receive a personal summons from the Archbishop, who offers a formal apology and an admonishment of those responsible. This cutscene is a good example of how much more cinematic the storytelling has become, especially this part right here.
That will be all, Sir Zephyrin. I would speak with our guest in private.
Your Eminence, As you wish, Your Eminence. That will be all for today.
He then admits to consorting with the Ascians. Apparently they offered him power in exchange for continuing the Dragonsong War, but the Archbishop isn't interested in their schemes. He's just listening to what they have to say and biding his time for the inevitable conflict. He suggests working together to be rid of them for good. So from this, we can see that the Archbishop is quite a calculating individual, and I think it sets up his character rather nicely. Immediately afterwards, we learn that General Roban is to be executed for crimes against the Sultanate. With the help of Lady Yugiri, we track down Roban within Halatali and have a confrontation against Ilberd, Yuyuhase, and Laurentius. Naturally, we destroy them, and Ilberd tells the Warrior of Light that they are both pawns to be used by others, noting his lack of progress in freeing his homeland despite all his years of servitude. He then retreats, but not before declaring that there is nothing he would not give to take back Alamigo, and this is something that eventually comes full circle. We're then directed to the Waking Sands, where we learn that everything that occurred at the end of A Realm Reborn was nothing more than a ruse conceived by Lolorito to get rid of Teleji Adeleji. Basically, Lolorito caught wind of Teleji's plot to assassinate the Sultana and had her lady-in-waiting switch out the poison for a slumber-inducing bile instead. This explains that scene with the two of them at the end of the base game, and there's a collective sigh of relief all round. That's right, Nanamo was never dead to begin with, but this is something we shall discuss in more detail a little later. So with all that out the way, this is where Heavensward really starts to get going. Alphinaud comes up with a plan to use Lady Iceheart as an intermediary to try and convince Nidhogg to abandon his bloody course against Ishgard, especially after she lamented her crimes earlier, and Estinian tags along. When we find her, she scoffs at the notion that we can stem the Dravanian tide with talk, and proceeds to recount the story of Saint Shiva. When the Elizans migrated to Kurthus 1,000 years ago, it was already home to dragonkind, and they were not about to make way for invaders, so a bloody war broke out between them. Amidst the fighting, a woman named Shiva attempted to parley with the dragons, and discovered them to be possessed of profound intelligence and reason. The great worm Hraesvelgr so enchanted her that the two of them fell in love. However, in the eyes of a near-immortal dragon, the life of an Elizan is mere moments, and such musings haunted Hraesvelgr, as he knew that all too soon she would be taken away from him. With this in mind, Shiva convinces him to consume her, so that their spirits might be entwined for eternity, and soon after, the tale of their love spread throughout the two factions. Following this, man and dragon lived in harmony for some 200 years. That is, until a group of traitorous Elizans discovered that the worm's eyes are the wellsprings of their strength, and set out to take them by force. Nidhogg was the dragon who lost an eye that day, and has waged war against Ishgard ever since. This is the second interpretation of the Dragonsong War's origins we receive. Izel claims that until he retrieves his eye, no amount of words will stay his fury, but Estinian believes there is more going on here. He has brought the eye with him and can feel Nidhogg's pursuit of it, but the Great Worm still has his attention fixed on Ishgard, suggesting he attacks the capital for another reason, with the Azure Dragoon believing reason has all but left him in his thirst for vengeance. So Alphinaud suggests we seek an audience with Hraesvelgr instead, to see if he will welcome our efforts to broker a peace. Izel agrees to take us to him, and this is where the main chunk of 3.0's story plays out. We travel through distant lands with Estinian, Izel, and Alphinaud to learn the real truth behind the Dragonsong War, and each character provides their own perspective on events that unfold. In this respect, Heavensward feels like an old-school Final Fantasy game, offering a much more adventurous undertaking than anything A Realm Reborn did. Personally, I think this is one of the best parts of the entire MSQ. There really is something quite magical about this journey, but it does have its issues, which we shall soon discuss. We first travel through the Dravanian Fallens, one of my all-time favorite areas in this game, primarily for the music, which is just amazing. During our time in the Fallens, the game is quick to establish each character's stance, Izel as pro-Dravania, Estinian pro-Ishgard, and Alphinaud as the neutral party. Being on opposite sides of the conflict, Izel and Estinian are repeatedly clashing with one another. It's a very prominent aspect of this story, one that serves to complement characterization and at times world building. Ultimately, this ends up being quite endearing, as both of them have their views challenged, and it affects them in a noticeable manner as the narrative proceeds. Overall, characterization was weak in the base game, but here that starts to change. Anyway, we meet with Vidofnir, a lesser dragon and brood of Hraesvelgr, and at her request we take down Ravana, a badass looking primal. I really love what Izel says to us after we defeat him, that watching us draw upon the full extent of our power from afar was a marvel to behold. With our deeds, Vidofnir opens a path to Som Al, but not before warning Estinian to keep the power of Nidhogg's eye in check. Izel and Estinian continue their bickering towards each other, and I find it a bit odd that this cutscene is not voice acted. Actually, this is a minor gripe I have with Heavensward. There are certain scenes that should definitely have been voice acted in my opinion, and this is only one of them. The next one comes immediately after the dungeon, where Estinian momentarily collapses under the weight of Nidhogg's fury, bleeding through the eye. I know voice acting is always reserved for the most important cutscenes in this game, and it's expensive, time-consuming, it needs to be planned ahead, etc, etc, but I think these scenes deserve it, especially the one we'll talk about next. Past the dungeon, we find ourselves in the Churning Mists. After some back and forth with the local Moogles, they give us a horn we can use to summon Hraesvelgr at a place called Zenith. Along the way, our party rests for a bit, and this is a really lovely cutscene. Alphinaud has a moment of introspection where he admits to his own hubris, leading to the downfall of the Scions. Izel and even Estinian offer some words of comfort to him, both reflecting on their upbringings and acknowledging their misconceptions. It's a beautiful moment in its own right. In fact, it's one of the best scenes in Heavensward, which makes it all the more baffling that it is not voice acted. I really think it should have been. When we finally make it to Zenith, we have our grand meeting with Hraesvelgr in all his glory, and it is quite stunning. Alphinaud comments that he hears the tongue of dragons, yet the meaning rings clear within his mind, and I've always loved that little detail. We receive a lot of important information here, so bear with me as I go over it. Izel attempts to persuade the Great Worm by claiming that she is the soul of Shiva reborn, but Hraesvelgr laughs off her delusion, revealing that the Shiva, whose form she assumed, is nothing more than a deity of her own making, a false imitation spun from the threads of her own misplaced belief. This shatters her faith, and she is left distraught. Alphinaud insists upon Hraesvelgr's aid in a call for peace, and in response, the Great Worm details the naked truth. After Shiva died, the dragons lived in harmony with man for some 200 years. During this time, the Elizans learnt much about them, not least that the eyes of a great worm are the wellsprings of their strength. He tells us that King Thordan and his Knights 12 lured his sister, Ratatoska, into an ambush and claimed her eyes, feeding on them afterwards to gain strength far beyond that of mortal men. Nidhogg was the first to learn of this atrocity and took to the skies, hungry for vengeance. Although he slew Thordan and a few of his knights, those who remained defeated the Great Worm, and he was forced to flee from battle. So here we have the third and final interpretation of the war's origins. This is how it actually began. Naturally, Estinian is skeptical and asks Hraesvelgr why we should believe his version of events, to which the Great Worm simply states that what we believe is immaterial, and that this ancient betrayal still haunts their kind. He goes on to explain that the Dragonsong War is not one of extinction, but rather one of punishment, more akin to a siege of the spirit. When Ishgardians are tired of the torment and side with dragonkind, as we have seen from those branded heretics, they are able to transform into newborn dragons to join the ranks of Nidhogg's ever-growing army. This is because all the traitor's progeny, i.e. every Ishgardian alive today, bear a trace of Ratatoska's essence, and a single sip of Dravanian blood is enough to awaken it. Even if there are those who choose to fight to the end, like Estinian, their vigor will eventually be spent with age, whilst Nidhogg shall remain to torment their offspring.
Oft have I wondered why Nidhogg did not simply raze Ishgard to the ground. Now I have my answer. He has no intention of winning the Dragonsong War, for it is no war at all, but vengeance. An eternal requiem sung for his murdered sister.
Because the dragons perceive time differently, what was done by the Elizan's ancestors some 1200 years ago is closer to the present for Nidhogg, which fuels his bloodlust, and essentially means this entire mission to Parley was doomed from the start. It is a massive bombshell. Not so much that the Elizans are to blame, because I think we could all see that coming in some respect, but rather the war being an eternal punishment, and every Ishgardian being descendants of the High Houses. This confirms everything Izel and Midgard Sorma were alluding to in A Realm Reborn, that sons must answer for the misdeeds of their fathers and whatnot, and I greatly enjoy that continuity, but I also enjoy how there are some details that even she was not aware of. This piece of dialogue from Alphino following the meeting is amongst my favorites in the entire game. Hraesvelgr was every bit as awe-inspiring as I imagined, his voice fairly dripped with power, the will behind his words so undeniable that it transcended my ignorance of the dragon's tongue. 'Tis but a pity that I misliked what he said. So far did we travel, even unto the very heavens themselves, only to be dismissed like unruly children. And far from mitigating this humiliation, the hidden truths we have learned serve only to prove that our grand mission of peace was destined to fail from the first. Nothing will deter Nidhogg from his course. I like that writing, it's a succinct summary of our journey and meeting. Estinian believes there is only one option left for us. We must find Nidhogg and slay him outright.
With the tale of our ancestors' vile betrayal yet ringing in your ears, you speak of continuing this war?
Nay, lady. I would but pierce its vengeful heart. When Nidhogg dies, this war shall die with him.
So we head to the Eyrie, Nidhogg's lair, but apparently we cannot access it because it is surrounded by tempestuous winds. This has us consult with Cid, who starts working on a new airship, which will allow us to bypass said winds. This ends up being annoyingly convenient because from here, the game has us go back to the Waking Sands to finalize the Sultana situation. We eventually find and confront Nanamo's former lady-in-waiting before Lolorito himself makes an appearance and goes on to explain exactly what happened at the end of A Realm Reborn. How he caught wind of Telegi's scheme to assassinate the Sultana, switched out the poison with a slumber-inducing bile instead, manipulated pretty much everyone including Ilberd and Roban to get his own way, and prevent Telegi from carrying out his plans. Not long afterwards, relations soured between Lolorito and Ilberd, and they cut ties. Roban is understandably outraged, but he does admit that Lolorito did save the Sultana's life, and calls for peace between all parties. The Lalafell presents Roban with an antidote to awaken the Sultana from her slumber, which he administers post-haste. Nanamo instantly awakens, and Roban is clearly over the moon. It's quite sweet. I enjoy Lolorito's constant scheming as much as anyone else, but this whole business with the Sultana is about as truncated a plotline we have ever received in this game. The biggest problem with it is that it breaks the flow and pacing of 3.0 by taking us away from the action twice. The first time I don't mind too much because the real meat of the expansion has yet to unfold. It's also the last time we see Ilberd for a while, and the long break between his appearances makes his eventual reveal all the juicier. But the second time, we are right outside Nidhogg's lair, and the game brings everything to a halt to tie up a loose end from the previous story. Look, I'm not entirely sure where else it could have been placed. It's clear the writers wanted to resolve it quickly, and that's exactly what they have done, but taking us away from the action like this stunts the momentum. The other problem is that it undermines the ending of A Realm Reborn, including the major twist that is Nanamo's death, and the dramatic political shakeup in Uldar that was meant to follow. What's more, Lolorito, Roban, Nanamo's lady-in-waiting, and eventually Nanamo herself as well, they all just make amends and carry on as if nothing ever happened, and it feels rather odd. However, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, we do receive some payoff for this as the story continues into the later expansions. Nanamo grows into her role and becomes a more astute politician, and Lolorito ends up helping her in doing so, because he understands the importance of maintaining the status quo in Uldar. After Telegi is killed, there's no benefit of keeping up the ruse of Nanamo's supposed death, which is why he doesn't let it become public knowledge in the first place. It's one of those political intrigue situations that seems worse than it is in isolation. I still greatly dislike how it takes us away from the action, but as I say, there is some payoff that I believe benefits the story in the long run. One more thing I want to mention, as much as I love seeing Nanamo alive and well, this marks the beginning of a rather dubious trend in FF14, where characters are made to look like they die but are in fact alive. I guess you could trace it back to La Habrea in 2.0, but he is an Ascian, and we know they cannot die by normal means, so I don't count it. His is also by far the least egregious of the so-called fake-out deaths, because his continued existence is immediately revealed to us. I do have a few things to say about all this, but I think it would be more appropriate in the Stormblood video, so I'll save it for then. The game takes this opportunity to give Alphinaud another moment of introspection. He tells us it was his own naivety and pride which allowed the Crystal Braves to fall to corruption. He announces that he will disband the Braves, hunt down all those who sided with Ilberd, and remain a proud member of the Scions. I'm glad the writers continuously highlight Alphinaud's development. These instances of self-reflection make him much more likable, and considering how ever-present he is in the story, this ends up being extremely valuable moving forward. So anyway, following this we ride with Estinian to the Eyrie and promptly take out Nidhogg via a dungeon. There's a memorable cutscene at the end where Estinian plucks out the Great Worm's only eye, but I gotta say, Nidhogg seems to have been dealt with in a somewhat anticlimactic manner. I mean, we literally just walked into his lair and killed him. Kind of diminishes how big a threat he is made out to be. This isn't the last of Nidhogg, of course, but it does feel a little off. This is where we receive a vision of the past that details the immediate aftermath of Nidhogg's defeat at the hands of Thordan I and his Knights 12 around 1200 years ago. Here we see Haldreth, the son of Thordan and the original Azure Dragoon, presenting to his fellow knights the Eyes of Nidhogg after claiming them himself. However, he expresses regret over his role in the betrayal of Ratatoska and refuses to claim the Mantle of King. He abandons the Knights 12 to forge his own path, and a few of his comrades follow him, leaving only 4 remaining, who go on to found the High Houses of Ishgard. Given that the visions granted by the Echo must be accepted as immutable truth, this cutscene confirms Hraesvelgr's account of how the Dragonsong War started, and how the High Houses came to be. However, when we explain the vision to Estinian, things don't add up.
If Haldreth took both of Nidhogg's eyes, then how came this eye to be lodged in the worm's skull? Beneath every answer we unearth, another question lies buried.
Estinian believes Hraesvelgr has kept some details from us, and he's right. It's revealed that the eye we plucked from Nidhogg originally belonged to Hraesvelgr, who gave it to him after he blamed his brother for the Elizon's betrayal. Izel accuses the Great Worm of surrendering his eye to Nidhogg, knowing full well the suffering he would inflict, but Hraesvelgr just brushes this off and flies away.
'Twas my life's goal to slay Nidhogg, but I find there is little joy to be had in its accomplishment.
But you have rid the world of a hate-filled creature, and ended a bloody war in so doing.
I lost my family to Nidhogg's flames, and 'twas with fury in my heart that I took up the lance. Every blow I struck in the name of vengeance. We were not so different, he and I.
I will not judge you for your deeds. I have not the right. Too many innocents have perished in the name of my greater good.
Yet even with all that has passed, the tale is incomplete. We are short a great worm's eye. Of the pair which Haldreth took from Nidhogg, only one is known to us, the one I bear. What then became of the other?
I really enjoy how Heavensward maintains the mystery behind the Dragonsong War. Despite receiving the full picture from Hraesvelgr, questions still remain. The breadcrumb-like clues we are fed indicate there is still more to uncover, and it is greatly engaging. Anyway, we're then informed that fighting has broken out in Ishgard. Supposedly some commoners threw open the gates to a force of heretics, so we rush over there.
Let us away, warrior of light. The people must be saved from themselves.
Upon our arrival, we have a meeting with the entire gang in the Fortom Manor and recount the truth revealed to us by Hraesvelgr. Sir Emeric is deeply concerned by these revelations and intends to confront the Archbishop personally to see if they have kept the truth hidden this entire time. Everyone pleads for him to reconsider, but he explains himself very eloquently.
Sir Emmerich, you cannot mean to raise this matter with the Archbishop.
Pray consider what you are proposing. If the Holy See chose to conceal the truth for centuries, what reason would they have to reveal it now?
At best, you will be branded a heretic and clapped in irons.
Then at least the Archbishop will have shown his true colors. My friends, this war will never truly be at an end until the truth is made known. You must see what lies on the horizon if it is not. When ruled by fear of a common enemy, we were united. But now we have none. During the war, the highborn needed men to lead and the lowborn men to follow. Not anymore. 'Tis but a matter of time before the old order is called into question. Lady Iceheart will share the truth with her followers, and the Holy See will be powerless to stop its spread. The disenfranchised will rise up united, and blood will flow in the streets once more. A divided Ishgard will not survive.
God, Sir Emmerich is such a hero, but there is a reason he goes with confidence. Lucia reveals that certain rumors have surrounded Sir Emmerich for a long time, that he is actually the Archbishop's bastard son, which Lucia thinks will help keep him safe and allow us to rescue him should things go awry. Everyone pledges their support for him and we make our preparations. The Archbishop's bastard son, ladies and gentlemen. That is something I was not expecting, but it does add even more drama to the mix and creates a great concern for the man. From here we meet with a lady named Hilda, who ends up being a terribly underutilized character, and devise a plan to free Sir Emmerich from within the vault. We do just that, and at the end of the dungeon he attempts to reason with the Archbishop, explaining that there is no need for further deception, but the old man calls him a fool, stating that such revelations would tear down the very pillars of Ishgardian society, built over 1,000 years. And he's not wrong. We attempt to stop his escape, but Sir Zephyrin launches a spear of light towards us, and Haurchefant is mortally wounded when he protects us from the attack. The Archbishop then boards his airship whilst mentioning a place called Azisla. With his final breath, Haurchefant bids us farewell and reminds us that a smile better suits a hero. Poor Haurchefant, dude did not deserve this shit. The scene that follows right after this, where Count Edmont grieves for his son, is one of the most poignant moments in the entire game. It's quite devastating. Once the dust has settled, we have a meeting with Sir Emmerich and receive a vision of his conversation with the Archbishop, who confirms everything Hraesvelgr said and admits to concealing the truth this entire time. The Archbishop argues that despite the great sin committed by their ancestors, it is not fair to expect the people of today to meekly surrender themselves to an eternity of punishment. For dragons who see the wrongs of antiquity as those of yesterday, no reparations will ever suffice, and that alone serves as ample justification for maintaining the lie, especially in the face of countless Ishgardians who have died for the cause. It may be a noble gesture, but it is not a trifling matter to simply change the status quo. There is some sense to the Archbishop's reasoning here, but there's a selfish angle to it as well, with the high houses and the church benefiting most from the current state of affairs. As Count Edmont says, if the truth does come out, the legitimacy of their rule will be called into question. The Archbishop also needs the people to revere the church for his grand plan to work, which we will see later on. The team deduce that the Archbishop aims to summon a primal, classic move, specifically to use his body as a vessel to summon King Thordan I. We receive word that the Archbishop's airship was spotted in the Sea of Clouds, so we head over there to look for him, which eventually has us take on Bismarck in a trial to get the key needed to access Azisla. And as soon as we get it, the Archbishop pops out of nowhere with an Ascian in tow named Igiorm and steals it from us. He then uses it to open a path to Azisla, and this is where a set of floating islands descend from the sky, the handiwork of the ancient Allegans. It's also here where we have a brief encounter with the Garleans, including their new emperor, Varys Zos Galvus. Nothing actually happens in this little confrontation. It just seems to be the game's way of reminding us of the threat that the Garleans pose, and I must admit I had kind of forgotten about them, so I guess it makes sense. We hop on Cid's airship to chase down the Archbishop, but Azizla is surrounded by an etheric barrier preventing us from reaching the place. Cid suggests we create a ram of sorts to pierce the barrier, but he doesn't know how to make one. We need to find someone who may know how, and with some assistance from Tataru, that person ends up being Y'shtola. If you speak with Alphino here, he describes Tataru as no less a scion than you or him, because her knack for acquiring information has proven vital to our endeavors, and any recognition for Tataru is something I welcome. Now, rather annoyingly, this is where things slow down a bit. Soon enough we discover that, at the end of A Realm Reborn, Y'shtola used a spell that transferred her ether into the life stream. We quickly go about freeing her from the stream, but unfortunately she doesn't know how to create such a ram. She does know someone who will, though, her former master, Matoya. This has us travel through a brand new zone, the Dravanian hinterlands, and we have to do a bunch of quests with the goblins of Idleshire, visit Master Matoya, and complete a dungeon to make said ram. I want to point out here that this is a fairly sizable chunk of the adventure, and as such it is easily the worst part of 3.0. If saving Nanamo stunted the momentum, this practically kills it. All the urgency surrounding the Archbishop is put on hold so we can engage in various shenanigans that completely breaks the immersion. It's another section that interrupts the flow and pacing of the story right as it's reaching its apex, no less. I have always hated how the game takes us away from the action here. These quests serve as that extra push to level 60, but it goes on too long and feels awkwardly placed. It ends up being terrible. It also makes the Dravanian hinterlands a bit redundant. This area has nothing to do with the story of Ishgard. It's not directly connected to the main narrative like every other zone is. The Sea of Clouds is not much better, admittedly, but at least something with the Archbishop happens there. The only times we ever head to the hinterlands involves Master Matoya in some form or fashion, and that is true for the post 3.0 patches as well. It just makes the zone seem somewhat detached from the main storyline. Anyway, after obtaining everything we need to make the ram, we head back to Ishgard and set off for Azizla. Before doing so, there's a lovely cutscene with Count Edmont where he explains that Haurchefant begged him to accept us into his household, describing us as hope incarnate, which the Count thought was just hyperbole, but now sees it as the truth. He gives us Haurchefant's broken shield as a memento and wishes us well. This is another scene I think should have been voice acted, but it's a nice moment either way. We also see Y'shtola warn Estinian of the dangers of carrying Nidhogg's eye, stating that it burns with insatiable hatred, and should he falter for so much as a moment, it will surely consume him. Finally, Urianger appears out of nowhere and gives us white auracite, and we head off. With the attached ram, we successfully break through the barrier, but the Garleans are hot on our tail with their leviathan of a battleship, prompting Biggs to say one of the best lines in this entire game.
Chief, we've got an Imperial battleship on our tail, and it's bleeding massive.
Things are looking grim, but Izel appears riding on the back of Hraesvelga to halt the Garleans' advances. Though she does cause damage to the airship and secures our escape, she unfortunately dies in the process. I must say, I found this kind of upsetting on my first playthrough. Izel is the only character in this game who starts off as a villain and ends up being a trusted companion, one who could have potentially joined the Scions. She is unique in that regard, and traveling with her towards the Churning Mists is an extremely memorable part of the story. I grew to really like her character, so seeing her die like this sucks. Her death has always hit me harder than Haurchefant's. We arrive on Azizla, and after some back and forth, we make our way into the giant flagship in the middle of the zone. Along the way, we encounter another of Midgardsormr's brood, the Great Worm Tiamat. She basically explains that the key to peace is to eliminate the Ascians, the same Ascians she once made a deal with to revive Bahamut, which unfortunately resulted in the Elder Primal, a shade of his former being. As penance for accepting their help, she has resigned herself to this prison, bound for all eternity. It's here where our last Crystal of Light rekindles itself, and we receive Hydaelyn's blessing once more. Midgard-Sorma finally acknowledges that we are worthy of the blessing, and we make our way to the flagship. This is another instance of continuity that I really enjoy in this story. It's been quite a hefty journey since we lost the Blessing of Light, and it feels good to prove that we are truly worthy of it. I also want to say that Aziz La is fascinating. It's such a massive visual contrast to anything we have seen before in the story. After the abundance of natural beauty in the previous zones, I feel like this zone is a great way to finish off 3.0. It's not as pretty, and traversing it can be a pain in the ass without the ability to fly, but otherwise I've always found it rather captivating. We descend into the dungeon, and at the end of it face off against both Lahabrea and Iggiorm. With the white aura sight we got from Urianger and the Eye of Nidhogg, we defeat Iggiorm for good. And this is where the Archbishop shows up with his Heavensward. The Archbishop reveals the location of the second of Nidhogg's eyes. It was always in the possession of the Holy See, lying together with the body of Haldreth. He goes on to explain to Lahabrea specifically that they were never going to serve as the Ascians' pawns.
My Ascian friend, long have you and your kind sown the seeds of chaos by teaching mortals the secrets of summoning. But if you assumed that we would meekly serve as your pawns, then you are gravely mistaken.
You would raise a hand against us.
By taking unto my flesh the soul of the legendary King Thordan, I can become a god!
Not cessation, whose being is sustained by a millennium of fervent prayer, and the eye's nigh bottomless reservoir of ether.
What?
Your contempt for man has proven your undoing, Ascian. For my first act as God King, I do hereby sentence you to die!
And just like that, 2 Ascians are eliminated from the realm, and honestly, I love this power play from the Archbishop, but we cannot let him get away with his plans. Our final task is to take on King Thordan and his Knights 12 within the Singularity Reactor, one of my all-time favorite fights in this game. It is a stunning way to cap off 3.0, with incredible music and visuals. Unfortunately, it is so pathetically easy these days that it legitimately feels like a parody of itself, which is a shame. Square Enix seriously need to do something about this, but either way, brilliant encounter. After defeating him, Astinian appears and retrieves the second of Nidhogg's eyes, relieved that they are finally reunited, but like clockwork, Nidhogg's spirit exploits this moment of weakness and consumes Astinian, using his body to regain a physical form, as was foreshadowed many times throughout 3.0. Atop Midgard Sorma, we make our escape and head back to Ishgard. Sir Emmerich announces his intentions to fight for true peace between dragon and man, whilst Midgard Sorma warns him that Nidhogg has claimed Estinian and that the real test is still to come. As the credits roll, we see Ishgard formally rejoin the Eorzean alliance, with the four leaders pledging their support for the future of Eorzea. We also place Haurchefant's shield by his grave, and Tataru declares that rebuilding the Scions starts now.
So ends a glorious chapter in their tale. However, tumultuous days yet lie ahead for Ishgard. After 1,000 years under the yoke of the Church, the people take their first tentative steps into the unknown. And though they spy a glimmer of peace upon the horizon, Nidhogg's vengeful shadow yet remains to darken the way. Be that as it may, so long as the young commander of the Temple Knights and his heroic companions are there to guide them, the people may hold fast to hope. The hope that one day true peace will return to Ishgard, and that man and dragon may live in harmony once more. Let the deeds writ herein never be forgot, that they may inspire generations yet unborn to strive ever heavensward.
A post-credit scene has Elidibus discussing the balance between light and dark. He states that it is time for this mysterious figure, whom he refers to as the Warrior of Darkness, to join the fray. They appear to be standing on the moon as well, which of course is a reoccurring motif in the Final Fantasy series, and something this game eventually comes back to. And that is 3.0, ladies and gentlemen. We're not quite done yet, but it is clear that this is a much more elaborate narrative compared to A Realm Reborn, and it's pretty good. Anyway, let's continue. So we've defeated the Archbishop and uncovered that Ishgard's entire history was in fact a massive lie, which, as you can probably imagine, has been quite a shock for its citizens. By the time 3.1 begins, Sir Emmerich has revealed the true origins of the war and all it entails to the people, insisting that the time for deception has passed. However, many are denying this truth. This is the part of Heavensward where some focus is placed on the people of Ishgard and how they respond to these revelations, which is something I think was important for the writers to highlight. It makes sense that the Ishgardians struggle to come to terms with the truth. It has been 1,000 years after all, and if everyone just carried on as if nothing ever happened, that would undermine just how monumental these revelations truly are. Sir Emmerich has us invite Vidofnir to Ishgard personally, to open a dialogue between their people and bring an end to the Dragonsong War once and for all. We do just that, and Vidofnir essentially says she'll get back to us. After this, we head to Idleshire to meet a brand new character, Kryl Baldessian, who has agreed to aid us in the search for our missing comrades. With the help of Master Matoya, Kryl discerns Thancred's location somewhere in the Dravanian Fallens. After some back and forth, our path leads us to Ravana, who is being taken down by a group of adventurers, but they are quick to recognize the Warrior of Light and proceed to attack our party. This is where Thancred shows up himself, and a great fight scene plays out.
Mark well our faces, warrior of light. For we are the warriors of darkness. Walkers of a different path. And we shall meet again.
Warriors of Darkness? Really?
So just like that, Thancred is back. He explains that he was caught in the life stream with Y'shtola and emerged from it in the Dravanian Fallens. How he managed to do this is never explained, but I guess he just wasn't trapped in it like Y'shtola was. Regardless, Thancred joins our party once again, and we receive word from Vidofnir that she accepts Sir Emmerich's invitation. And right after this is a scene where Sir Emmerich gets stabbed on the streets of Ishgard, with the narrator stating that some think he is a scheming patricide. Don't worry though, he ends up making a full recovery. I hear some people consider this a fake-out death, but I've never viewed it like that. It doesn't make sense for Sir Emmerich to die here, so I just assumed that he would live. I guess you could describe it as an attempt at cheap drama and all that, but I think it's more to show that the people of Ishgard are still greatly divided. Like the example with Lahabrea I mentioned earlier, Sir Emmerich's continued existence is immediately revealed to us, so I don't think it's all that bad. Either way, this is where some drama goes down. A group called the True Brothers of Faith seize control of the vault, taking hostages in doing so. The True Brothers accuse Sir Emmerich of patricide and high treason, demanding that he surrender himself. So naturally, it's up to us to take them down and free the hostages. This leads us to a solo duty, and at the end of it, one of the priests pushes a lowborn child off the roof of the vault, seemingly to her death, but she is saved by Vidofnir, who just so happened to be circling nearby. Sir Emmerich thanks the dragon for her timely intervention, but she warns of Nidhogg's return and that their troubles are not yet over. Lord Edmont arrives and reminds Sir Emmerich of the challenges ahead, that the actions of the True Brothers are misguided, but are also to be expected in some form. The patch ends with a scene where Urianger and Elidibus are scouring some tomes, but we don't really learn anything from this. They are also joined by the Warrior of Darkness, whose actual name is Ardbert, and I shall be calling him that from here on out. The final scene is one with Ida and Papalimo, who are shown to be alive, but we learn nothing from this cutscene, only that a group called the Masks are preparing an attack on the Garleans. The start of 3.2 is all about tracking down Minfilia. After some detective work, Kral and the gang determine that she too was caught in the spell Y'shtola cast at the end of A Realm Reborn, but this time there is no residual trace of her, like there was with Thancred and Y'shtola. This culminates in a descent through a dungeon, the Anti-Tower, and at the end of it we are transported to the Mother Crystal's realm, where we learn of Minfilia's new existence as a being known as the Word of the Mother. Essentially what this means is that Minfilia has offered her body to Hydaelyn as the Mother Crystal's power is weakening. Now they speak as one. She goes on to recount the tale of Hydaelyn and Zodiark, how the former was forced to banish the latter to the distant heavens, specifically using the phrase "a moon bound," which is cool to see. This sundered the star, giving birth to 13 reflections of the source, basically alternate worlds. She explains that Zodiark longs to be made whole, and the Ascians labor to achieve this goal by bringing about calamities, each of which marks a rejoining, where the source violently reabsorbs the ether of a reflection, obliterating it in the process. She reiterates that the Ascians must be stopped before sending us back to the Anti-Tower. We explain all this to the team, and it's difficult for them to take. Minfilia no longer has a physical form in this world. It's particularly hard for Thancred, who was in love with her, on a parental level, as Thancred saw her as a daughter of sorts. The game is a little vague on the details of their relationship, but it's certainly nothing romantic. Either way, her absence ends up affecting Thancred's character, which we shall soon see. I don't have much to say about Minfilia given how bare bones her character was in A Realm Reborn. She obviously had importance, but mainly on the logistical side of things for the Scions, acting more as a facilitator of narrative progress rather than a driver of it. She does continue to play a role in this expansion, and a somewhat bigger one in Shadowbringers, but I've always been indifferent to her character. Anyway, in light of Vidofnir's miraculous rescue of that little girl, Sir Emeric has arranged a peace conference to be held at Falcon's Nest, so we head over there to oversee the preparations. Said preparations are then interrupted by a woman who cries out that the notion of peace is but a ruse formed by the Dravanians, a sentiment many Ishgardians share. It's here where Amanalain orders a guard to do something, which results in him firing an arrow into the lady, which of course she uses to her advantage, furthering her rhetoric to highlight the deception of the Highborn. It's basically a monumental cock-up from the lad, and with this Lucia feels there is no choice but to delay the peace conference. Soon afterwards we discover that Amanalain's ward, Onawar, has been beaten up by the crowd. The young lord is struck hard by what's taken place and lashes out at Thancred.
Stop looking to others. You make your choice and you live with the consequences.
And what would you know about consequences? You who always know just what to say and just what to do. Your every deed is greeted with a round of applause.
You know nothing about me. I have fought tooth and nail for the people I hold dear. Done everything in my power to save them. And I have failed. Learn to live with it. I have.
This is another instance of growth for one of the characters. Thancred becomes much more stoic in his personality following Minfilia's fate. He still maintains his customary dry wit, but it's good to see some development from another member of the Scions. This unfortunate fiasco leaves Sir Emeric and Count Edmont contemplating the best path forward. Eventually we agree to organize a joint military exercise with the other three city-states in the hopes it will rouse the people of Ishgard. By winning the melee, everything goes to plan, and the people are in high spirits once more, so the peace conference goes ahead. Sir Emeric and Vidofnir formally agree a pact of peace between their peoples, with the former presenting a sculpture depicting Hraesvelgr and Saint Shiva to symbolize his resolve. It's certainly a nice gesture, but I have always hated how Vidofnir physically gasps in response to it. She's a dragon, she doesn't need to react like a human. Unfortunately, the conference ends on a sour note as Nidhogg appears and impales Vidofnir with his lance, declaring that the final chorus of the Dragonsong War is nigh, and none shall escape his fury, before flying away. Thankfully, Vidofnir's wound is not mortal, and Nidhogg's actions this day has only strengthened our companion's resolve. Afterwards, Alphinaud has yet another moment of introspection. He says that he doesn't want to be a man who sacrifices his friend and family for a cause, and instead wishes to save Estinian no matter what. Even if it results in failure, he wants to at least try. 3.3 serves as the culmination of the Dragonsong War and the main storyline of Ishgard. It's the final climactic confrontation against Nidhogg. With some assistance from Midgard-Sorma, we end up recruiting Hraesvelgr to our side, to level the playing field so to speak, and as soon as we do, the Dravanian horde attacks Ishgard, so we head over there. Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr exchange words, which leads to a duel between the two, and it is quite stunning in its grandeur, with some great visuals. Ultimately, Nidhogg overpowers his brother, but at the last second, Hraesvelgr gives us his eye to use in our inevitable battle with Nidhogg. I won't lie and say I don't get some enjoyment from watching my Lalafell slowly waddle up to the eye with Dragonsong playing in the background, even if it is somewhat cheesy. Either way, this is where we face off against Nidhogg in the final steps of faith, a trial that, in my opinion, doesn't even come close to matching the epicness of the Singularity Reactor, but it's not bad by any means. After the battle, Nidhogg and Estinian's wills clash in his body, and the Azure Dragoon requests that we kill him to slay Nidhogg for good, claiming it will be his final duty. Alphino flat out refuses to do so, and with the power of friendship once more, we retrieve both eyes from Estinian's armor, defeating the Shade of Nidhogg permanently. Sir Emmerich tells us to cast the eyes into the abyss, and for some reason we oblige. I remember thinking this was a rather foolish thing to do on my first playthrough, and that is exactly what it ends up being. Hraesvelgr congratulates us on our victory, noting that it was our own power that led to our triumph, before wishing Estinian a swift recovery and flying away. The Azure Dragoon is taken to the infirmary, where he once again compares himself to Nidhogg, stating that without his comrades, his hatred would surely have consumed him, as it did to the Great Worm. He then decides to lay down the mantle of Azure Dragoon, as his hunt has finally come to an end. It's actually quite a moving cutscene, one of the very few instances where Estinian opens up emotionally. Following this, Sir Emmerich announces the end of the ruling line of archbishops, and instead creates a republic that will serve both high and lowborn alike. Church is separated from state, and although Sir Emmerich thought to relieve himself of his lofty position, he is effectively made head of the republic. At his investiture are the ambassadors of dragonkind, a perfect image to symbolize Ishgard's newfound peace. We also see Estinian has made a full recovery, thus bringing a definitive end to the Dragonsong War and Count Edmont's memoirs. Beautiful ending there, with a lovely piano piece to accompany it. Ultimately, I feel this is a satisfying conclusion to our foray in Ishgard. In 3.4, we receive an invitation from Sir Emmerich to dine with him at his estate. It's a wholesome moment where we recount the tale of our adventures, reaffirming the bond we now share with him as friends. The dinner is cut short, however, when it's announced that Thancred has returned to Fortemps Manor bearing an injured maiden. That maiden is Alize, Alphino's twin sister. She tells us she was tracking down the Warriors of Darkness and was shot by a poisoned arrow when escaping. She then warns us that they are in league with the Ascians and are attempting to summon Garuda, so we set out to stop them. After going through a dungeon, we encounter the Warriors of Darkness, who have a mysterious Elezen alongside them now, and it is painfully obvious who this guy is. Ardbert then explains their origin and purpose. The Warriors of Darkness hail from the first reflection of the Source, where they were the heroes blessed with Hydaelyn's light. He tells us that not all worlds hold light and dark in equal measure, and in the first, light is the greater power by far. With this power they defeated the Ascians, eliminating darkness, but as a result a flood of light emerged and annihilated life itself. Before long, this light will consume their world, leaving nothing in its wake, which is an interesting subversion. According to him, the only way to save the first is to bring about another calamity in the Source. They hope to accomplish this by defeating primals with ease, so the beast tribes respond by summoning more powerful primals, basically sowing chaos. The Warriors of Darkness quickly go on their way after revealing their grand scheme. In response to this new threat, the team, accompanied by Alize now, awesome, go about trying to identify the source of the Beast Tribe's crystals, to prevent further summoning. This leads us back to Lenosha, where we must take down Titan once more. Along the way, we encounter this young kobold named Garbu, who loses his parents and becomes traumatized in the process, leaving him in a catatonic state. This upsets Alize greatly, and is a plot point the game returns to much later on. Eventually, we're informed by Urianger that a shipment of crystals has been delivered to an Alamegan resistance group, so we head over to Little Alamigo to investigate. Here we learn of a masked man named the Griffin, who has formed a new faction within the resistance called the Masks, the most aggressively militant group to join the movement in recent memory. The Griffin is described as a charismatic and capable commander, drawing people to his cause with his passion and vision. As it turns out, he is delivering a speech nearby, so we check it out. At said speech, the Griffin does indeed deliver a rousing address and vows that the Alamegan standard will be raised over their homeland once more. This is where we run into Ida and Papalymo. They explain how they escaped the banquet at the end of A Realm Reborn with the aid of some old friends from the Resistance and decided to stick around to help them out. They go on to explain that the Griffin doesn't trust the Scions, and that the man we saw delivering the speech was in fact a body double. The real Griffin is an extremely cautious and distrusting man, making every effort to conceal his identity. When we mention that crystals are involved, Ida and Papalymo help set up a meeting with the imposter. The man confirms that he is not the real Griffin, but states that the crystals were used to reach an accord with the Amalja, and not to summon a primal. So we head over to the Amalja to check up on things and have a final showdown against the Warriors of Darkness. Things are looking grim, but then the mysterious Elizan shows up to save our arses, who turns out to be Urianger, who was just pretending to be in league with the Warriors of Darkness. What a surprise. As the battle draws to its close, Ardbert reveals that he and his comrades are actually ethereal beings, like the Ascians, meaning they died in the first, which paints a sad picture for them. They literally gave everything to save their world, and it still wasn't enough, so now they're willing to side with the Ascians to try and make it right. Another instance of characters being misguided. In a last act of desperation, the Warriors of Darkness pull out their crystals of light to do something? I honestly have no idea what this means, but at Urianger's behest we pull out our crystal of light, and everyone is transported to Hydaelyn's realm. It's here where we are greeted by both the Word of the Mother and Minfilia. Her name changes in the text box. She reveals her intentions to go to the First and take the light unto herself, vowing that she will not let the world be all consumed. Apparently this was all orchestrated by Urianger to save the First, but he is fully aware that such a plan will likely prevent Minfilia from ever returning to the Source, which is a price she says she would gladly pay. It's once again hard for Thancred, but he comes to terms with her decision. The Warriors of Darkness ask if they can be taken with her, offering their own souls to Minfilia so they can go home. She accepts, and before leaving she gives us Louisoix's staff, Tupsumati. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this business with the Warriors of Darkness. I feel like this part of the story should focus entirely on the Alamegan resistance, to plant the seeds for the next expansion, and we do get some of that, but nowhere near the same level of attention that Ishgard got in A Realm Reborn. This plotline does directly feed into the Shadowbringers expansion, but it's impossible for me to say if going to the First was something the writers had always intended, especially at the time of Heavensward. I'd love to give them the benefit of the doubt and suggest it was all a part of their plan, but that seems overly romantic. For now, the Warriors of Darkness feel a little tacked on, and the whole thing with Urianger is a complete joke. I'm certain that was deliberate though, because the game drops some incredibly telltale hints concerning his identity. Following this, we head back to Mordona with Ida and Papalymo tagging along. The Scions are finally reunited, and whilst not everyone made it, we have a couple new faces in the form of Kral and Alize, and I must say, this is quite a lovely moment. The whole gang is back together again, feels like it's been an age since we last stood here. I particularly enjoy this scene where Alphino asks the Warrior of Light directly what comes next, with the camera then panning to each of the Scions, anticipating our answer. Everyone pledges to carry on their own individual tasks in the name of a brighter Eorzea. I do think it was inevitable that the Scions would be reunited sooner or later. I know a lot of people consider what happened to them at the end of A Realm Reborn as yet another series of fake-out deaths, which it basically is, but I think it's more that their fates were left up in the air. It's never clear what exactly happened to them, and I find that far less egregious than some of the later fake-out deaths. I totally understand why people see this as another means of undermining what happened at the end of the base game, but like with Nanamo, we do receive a payoff for it in the later expansions. I'm not trying to make excuses here, but I feel these things are worth addressing. Anyway, in the final scene of the patch, Papalymo requests he hold on to Tupsamati, so we give it to him. We then see Elidibus making contact with the real Griffin and gifts the man the eyes of Nidhogg, describing him as someone of boundless and bottomless despair, who has a heart which thirsts for vengeance, making him a fitting candidate to use them. And the very last scene is one with Nero, rummaging around the Cartano Flats. He's clearly looking for Omega, and apparently he's found it. 3.5 begins with a member of the Alamegan resistance, Monago, rushing to the Scions and warning them that the Griffin is planning something reckless. He aims to assault Baelsar's Wall, which is the name of a giant wall that divides the Black Shroud and the area surrounding Alamigo, Girabania. The team deem it necessary to warn the other city-states of his plans, and they subsequently mobilize troops in case conflict spills over into Gridania. Papalymo suggests we use secret tunnels to make our way to the top of Baelsar's Wall and try to talk the Griffin out of his schemes. Before we are able to do so, however, fighting breaks out at the wall, and the attackers are all wearing Grand Company uniforms. This is all a part of the Griffin's plan. He is using the wall as bait to force the Eorzean Alliance into renewed hostilities with the Garleans, so we infiltrate and attempt to stop him. Once we get to the top, we face off against the Griffin, who is revealed to be none other than Ilberd. I was not expecting this when I first played the game. It had been so long since we last saw the man that he escaped my mind. In hindsight, though, it seems fairly obvious. The Griffin is a man who distrusts the Scions and wants to free Alamigo. The signs point to Ilberd. Anyway, after defeating him in battle, Alphino shows up and urges him to surrender. But this is where Ilberd pulls out Nidhogg's eyes and delivers a fucking epic speech explaining his motivations.
Nidhogg's eyes! No abyss is too deep for you, I see. But trust me when I say that such power was not meant for mortal hands.
How long have I struggled to reach this point? My countrymen, so inured to the taste of defeat, they no longer balk at its bitterness, shouting my throat raw with rallying cries, only to be greeted with dull eyes and blank faces. My brothers and sisters in Ulda have surrendered to their apathy and their appetites. Were it not for the glint of Lodorito's coin, I doubt even those here now would have answered my call. Take back our homeland! Free Alamigo! Ha! They'll happily mouth the words, but they won't spill the blood. You say no mortal should wield these eyes? Then I shall gladly become a demon. I will suckle on the souls of the hopeless and liberate the homeland they no longer deserve.
I will suckle on the souls of the hopeless, ladies and gentlemen. Oh shit. Laurentius orders war machines to massacre the resistance fighters, and Ilberd declares that he shall use their sacrifice to summon a deity more terrible than the Elder Primal Bahamut. He then throws himself to his death to initiate the summoning. Remember when I said Ilberd's words come full circle? Well, here we are, and you cannot deny his conviction at the very least. A giant beam of light shoots up into the sky. The primal is taking shape, and this is on a scale we have never seen before. The Scions are not sure what to do here, but with the power of Tupsamati, Papalymo attempts to use a sealing spell, very similar to the one Louisoix used on Bahamut. Ida is concerned for Papalymo and wants to stay behind to help him, but the Lalafell urges her to find and follow her own path. Thancred, Hilda, and Ugiri show up on an airship, allowing us to escape. Papalymo casts the spell and successfully seals the primal in a cocoon of light, but in doing so he drains himself of his life force. And just like that, Papalymo is removed from the game, for real. But we'll talk more about this in the conclusion. So the Alliance leaders gather round and discuss what to do. A primal has been detected within the shell, so we can't just leave it. Deliberations ensue, but they struggle to reach a definitive answer. Then, out of nowhere, Nero comes along and suggests we use Omega in retaliation. Makes sense, Omega was designed to combat Bahamut after all. There's a bit of chit-chat here, but ultimately they agree that this is the only course left for them. We reconvene back at Mordona, where we're introduced to a brand new character, this towering samurai from Doma called Gosetsu. He's arrived here to request the aid of Lady Yugiri. He wants her to return to Doma with him and help assist their mutual master. Yugiri says that she must first settle things here in Eorzea, so Gosetsu ends up tagging along to the Cartano Flats. When we get there, we are ambushed by a Garlean contingent, but we swiftly deal with them and head into the control room. It doesn't take long at all for Cid and Nero to activate Omega, who has been designed to act wholly autonomously. Ida presses the big red button and the machine is let loose. What follows is one of the most memorable cutscenes in the entire game. Seeing the primal Shinryu burst out of its shell and call upon the very elements themselves to clash with Omega, alongside a magnificent musical piece to accompany it, is absolutely dazzling. It's an explosive way for Heavensward to end. The duel ends in a stalemate with the two entities seen crashing down in the area surrounding Alamigo. And because of this, the Alliance leaders finally decide to make contact with the Resistance representatives. We head over to Gridania and speak with Ida, who reveals that she is not actually Ida, but is instead her long-lost, presumed dead sister Lise, and has been this entire time. I will never forget witnessing this reveal on my initial playthrough and thinking, what? I do have a few things to say about this, but we'll get to that in the next video. She explains what happened to her, her sister, and her father the day the Empire marched into Alamigo. After Ida was killed, Lise assumed her identity because she was unsure of who she was herself and to preserve the memory of her sister. She declares that what she does from this day forth will be done as Lise, renewing her resolve to free Alamigo and walk her own path as she no longer hides behind her sister's mask and Papalimo's shadow. In a post-credit scene, Roban declares that he will take back his homeland for both him and Ilberd. And the very last scene is one where we receive a sneak peek of the new Imperial Viceroy, sitting upon his throne in Alamigo, who states that the coming days will be most interesting indeed. Thus ending the first expansion, Heavensward. So there we have it. That is Heavensward, ladies and gentlemen. A vastly more extravagant narrative experience than anything A Realm Reborn offered. There's a lot to like about Heavensward, particularly as a follow-up to the previous game. The storytelling has seen a dramatic jump in quality in terms of writing, pacing, characterization, drama, emotion, the list goes on. But what really sets it apart is the scale and scope of the adventure. This expansion benefits greatly from being a much more focused experience than its predecessor. There are times when it veers off course a bit, and we'll discuss that shortly, but otherwise focus is placed entirely on Ishgard, and every other aspect of the story follows suit. In comparison, A Realm Reborn introduces an entire continent, with the 3 city-states all given their fair share of attention, although admittedly Uldar gets the lion's share in the post-2.0 patches. The story was fixed on world building, and its action was split between many different factions and ideas, as mentioned in the previous video. Each area had their own plotline in the lead up to an inevitable primal encounter, but to accommodate every location, these plotlines were not deep at all. They weren't really allowed to be. They were quickly resolved, and the game was even quicker to move on to the next one. There's a final standoff against the Garleans, but that suffers from the same issues, as it only comes to a fore in the game's final act, around 3/4 of the way through. This meant that all the major story beats were restricted in scale, scope, and depth. In addition to this, everything is more or less resolved by the end of 2.0, and the smaller patches that follow are naturally restricted as well. With Heavensward, though, everything is designed in a way that complements the story of Ishgard and Ishgard alone. This gives the writers greater freedom to build and expand upon its many elements, which has ultimately resulted in a much more fully realized and fulfilling narrative. The game provides a host of information on its various aspects, from the stratification of society to the chronicles of the city, and how events have shaped it into the theocracy we see today. This single-mindedness creates a rich sense of lore and history, and through this the audience can develop a sincere appreciation for it. And given how this lore is directly connected to the game's narrative, that appreciation also extends to the story. I can't speak for other people, but by the time I finished Heavensward on my first playthrough, I felt a far deeper connection to Ishgard and its supporting characters than I ever did with Limsa, Gridania, and Uldar. Ishgard is just altogether more developed, taking center stage throughout all of 3.0 to 3.3, and as such it is far more compelling to me. In fact, the singular narrative approach employed here almost makes the base game feel like a collection of stories in comparison, and there's no doubt the expansion shines far brighter because of it. Heavensward excels in areas A Realm Reborn stumbled. Things were very black and white in 2.0. It was a battle of good versus evil, but the evil side were not fleshed out enough to make it interesting. Here, the antagonists are not only given clear and understandable motivations, but you could argue they're not in the wrong either, or at least that blame does not solely fall on them. Both the dragons and the Archbishop have their reasons. There is some sense to their actions, particularly for the Archbishop, who presents a fairly reasonable justification. Even if some of his intentions are selfish, he does express concerns over the societal impact that the truth of the Dragonsong War's origins would have on Ishgard and its people. The dangers that would ensue following news of this revelation is even something Sir Emmerich recognizes as well. Similarly, the same can be said for Lolorito, who, like the Archbishop, understands the importance of maintaining the status quo. Again, their methods are dubious, but these shades of grey make for more compelling circumstances. It also feels a lot more original than its predecessor. Now, if we take the overall premise of the expansion, it's not exactly groundbreaking. There's a nation embroiled in an ancient conflict spanning 1,000 years, against a race of creatures that are repeatedly painted as the antagonists. We set out on a quest to learn the truth behind the conflict's long history, and surprise, surprise, man is the one who was truly responsible. Oh, and by the way, those holier-than-thou fellas at the church, they're up to no good. I mean, this kind of story has been done before, but there are certain things about the way it is told here that I believe gives it something more. A prime example is how they play up the mystery behind the Dragonsong War's origins. Over the course of 3.0, we are told various accounts that are all slightly different from one another, and I intentionally described them as they are given in this video to highlight those differences. Ishgard's teachings followed by Izel's vision, and then the real truth revealed by Hraesvelgr. But even he omits some details, and even after we learn of those details, the story still isn't finished. We discover how the High Houses came to be, but questions remain over the whereabouts of the second of Nidhogg's eyes until just before the final battle with Thordan. I have always found that rather engaging, as it eggs you on little by little, and there's a cathartic sense of understanding at the very end. It's a slow burner that builds progressively and ends with a satisfying conclusion. But this is a case where the destination is undoubtedly secondary to the journey. Traveling with Izel, Estinian, and Alphinaud to speak with Hraesvelgr, it's one of the best parts of the entire MSQ for me. There's an almost childlike sense of wonder as we traverse fantastical lands, overcoming trials and learning more about the history of the area. And it's all coupled with a genuine feeling of growth and maturity. Izel and Estinian's constant bickering may seem contradictory to that, but it's just a part of their individual character arcs, and it adds to the overall charm of the adventure. They stand diametrically opposed, but in the end they both recognize that they have been misguided in their own way and come to terms with one another. Then we have Alphinaud, whose repeated acts of introspection breathe new life into his character, and when combined with Izel and Estinian, it creates a very endearing dynamic. All three of them have their views challenged and undergo actual development, something that was basically non-existent in the base game. Witnessing these characters' growth firsthand makes the entire journey so much more enjoyable, and the characters themselves easier to empathize with. It really does have that old-school Final Fantasy feel about it, more so than any other expansion I'd say, and the optional pieces of dialogue characters offer when you talk to them outside of quest progression, some of them are memorable in their own right. In fact, I would go as far as saying that the group dynamic of Izel, Estinian, and Alphinaud is the best thing about this expansion. I feel a deeper connection to these three characters than anyone else in the game, and that is testament to how much of an impact they have on the overall narrative experience. There's a piece of dialogue from Alphinaud in patch 3.1 where he describes Izel to Lucia that I want to highlight. Here was a woman with the blood of innocence on her hands, men, women, children, all slain in the name of the implacable Lady Iceheart. Yet she acknowledged her misdeeds and agreed to join us in common cause. At our side she fought in service to that greater good, even unto her dying breath, and while that does not absolve her of her sins, I hope that one day she will be remembered, not merely as a heretic, but as a misguided soul who dreamt of peace. It's a great piece of writing that sums up her character. When she was introduced as a villain in the previous game, I did not expect her to become surprisingly likable through Heavensward, but she's never portrayed as some tragic hero either. She is blinded by her faith and commits atrocities in the name of it, yet she still makes a lot of effort to better herself, and there's something intriguing about her arc because of it. Interestingly, she and Estinian serve as personifications of the war between dragon and man, where we have two sides, both fueled by grief and a personal sense of righteousness. The irony, though, is that Estinian is the one who more closely aligns with the dragons, as he is a reflection of Nidhogg, acting in the name of vengeance for his fallen family. These characters give meaning to the larger narrative in more ways than one. And that extends to the overall themes of the expansion as well, on the consequences of vengeance, obsession and loss, culminating in cycles of violence, and the importance of looking to the future rather than the past. We see these themes portrayed in almost all the main characters to varying degrees. Izel, Estinian, Nidhogg, the Archbishop, Hraesvelgr, Sir Emeric, Alphino, Thancred. There's a consistency to the writing here that involves the characters in a meaningful way. There's also a very real feeling of friendship now. This expansion is the reason why I am so fond of Sir Emeric. He's such an honourable fellow and does what he must in the name of a brighter future for Ishgard. Yeah, there are times when his idealism lends itself to naivety, but it's a window into the kind of man he is, and I like that we get to see him at his most vulnerable. What I love about Sir Emeric the most, though, is that, after everything we've been through, he considers us a friend above all else and reiterates that point regularly. As the story becomes more personal, the stakes are raised along with it, and through this we receive a few instances of genuine emotion. Haurchefant's death is one thing, but the way Count Edmont grieves for him afterwards has always been the more poignant scene for me. Izel is sadly taken away from us, and when Estinian retires from his post, there's a somber exchange between him and Sir Emeric. Then there's Thancred, who becomes noticeably more stoic following what happened to Minfilia, and these types of developments make the characters feel human. It's the quieter times where you find the most heart in Heavensward, and they make for some of its best moments. It is a much darker and grittier type of story than its predecessor, but it still manages to deliver instances of companionship without being overly cringy. It would be remiss of me not to mention all the monumental events that take place along the way, though. When we finally meet with Hraesvelgr in all his glory, it feels like a hugely significant milestone. I really enjoy how the Great Worms are portrayed here. They have this tremendous, exalted aura about them, ancient beings that are wise beyond measure. I find every encounter with them to be super absorbing. They all seem to have suffered some sort of tragedy in their lives as well. I guess that's to be expected when you're a near-immortal creature living for thousands of years, but the way they have all been entangled with the various lives on the Source is pretty fascinating. And the drama just keeps ramping up, with truths revealed and long-standing beliefs called into question as we rewrite the history of an entire nation, a nation at war with dragons. It's so grandiose and fantastical. There were times the game surprised me as well. It's made very clear that the Archbishop is up to something, but I still didn't expect him to take such a drastic, all-in approach by summoning Thordan and turning on the Ascians himself. Watching Lahabrea die by his hand after sentencing him to do so is such a great moment. And there's more to choose from as well. Estinian slaying Nidhogg in his lair, taking down the Archbishop and his Knights 12, all the way to the final showdown with Nidhogg on the Steps of Faith. Then there's the death of Ilberd and the epic speech he gives, which culminates in the summoning of Shinryu, as well as the clash between Shinryu and Omega. These are some of the most memorable sequences in the entire game. Heavensward is stunning when it wants to be. It delivers on those big moments in spectacular fashion, but beneath that is a proper adventure with mystery, drama, action, and perhaps most notably, emotion. There's an intimacy to the story now, and it elevates the experience into something far more memorable. I think it's worth highlighting the production values once more. I already mentioned the voice acting at the start of the video, but the overall presentation has been enhanced as well. Facial expressions and character animations look better, leading to unique interactions, such as when Kryl teases Alphino outside Idleshire, and when Alphino realizes that Minfilia is not coming back to the Scions. The reaction he has on his face is telling, and it's small details like these that help accentuate the feelings of the characters. Although the Scions definitely get the most love in this department. The cinematic fight scenes are fluid as well, like when Thancred faces off against Ardbert, and the immense clashes that occur in the post 3.0 patches. This also extends to the camera work, which is a lot more dynamic now. For the most part, cutscene shots were fairly static in the base game, whereas here there is a noticeable attempt to add more dynamism to certain scenes. I think the guys over at Square Enix have tried their best to work with what they have, but the overly simplistic art style and graphics of the game, with stuff like the basic repeated lip movements and such, don't really allow certain moments to be as effective as they possibly could. Either way, the attempt is notable. One of A Realm Reborn's biggest issues was its pacing, and in this area, Heavensward generally feels like an improvement. The only exceptions, which admittedly are extremely egregious, are the 3 times we are taken away from the action in 3.0, especially the part with Matoya and the Ram. I don't think they take the piss like some parts of A Realm Reborn did, but they are awful for the flow and pacing of the story. However, these are the only noteworthy examples I can think of. Unfortunately, it's because they are so noteworthy that they make up the worst parts of the entire expansion. The way Heavensward periodically stunts its own momentum is so jarring and harms the experience terribly. This expansion doesn't bounce between plot points as much as A Realm Reborn did, at least not to the same extent, but in a way it's even more apparent here because of how much more focused the rest of the storytelling is. These sections stand out for all the wrong reasons. They simply do not do the narrative any favors. In the post 3.0 patches, the entire sequence in Lenosha with Titan and Garbu is the only other time where things drag in a noticeable manner. This part is not excessively lengthy or anything, but it's kind of boring and filled with the usual monotonous back and forth. Make no mistake, Heavensward has plenty of moments where things slow down and plod along, like dealing with the Moogles and everything in the Sea of Clouds, but unfortunately that's just the nature of this game. There are pacing issues throughout the entire story. To touch on some of the more negative aspects, I feel like Papalymo gets done dirty in this expansion. He literally shows up for a couple cutscenes, and the next thing you know he is killed off. The cutscene itself is awesome, but his death feels a little forced, as if the writers had no idea what to do with him, and everyone seems to swiftly brush it off. Even for someone who started in Gridania, Papalymo has always felt like a background character to me, and given how little screen time he has here, his death falls flat. I never played 1.0, and maybe I would hold a different opinion if I had, but who can say? And then, to add injury to insult, Ida proceeds to make it all about herself in her identity reveal as Lys. The handling of it just seems a bit shoddy. The whole subplot with Nanamo is something else that feels shoddily handled as well, but I already talked about it in detail, so I won't spend too much time on it here. I seriously thought Nanamo died at the end of A Realm Reborn, but I had a gut feeling that the Scions would be found sooner or later. This is pure conjecture on my part, but I guess the writers felt the need to reset things at the end of the base game, which is why the Scions are all scattered at its conclusion. So they establish this grand shakeup in Ul'dah, but the story goes all in on Ishgard, and the loose ends are quickly resolved in a manner that feels lackluster. Again, I do think we receive a payoff for it in the later expansions, and I greatly enjoy how the Scions receive new outfits, but the execution here feels underwhelming. I also think Heavensward can be a bit Gorgonzola. It's kind of cheesy at times, like how Vidofnir saves that girl at the very last second, slowly walking up to the Eye of Hraesvelgr in dramatic fashion, and especially this part, where the woman who interrupts the peace conference is brought to tears by Sir Emmerich's emotional address. It's fitting given the circumstances, but I feel the writers are trying a bit too hard with shit like this, you know? Cheesiness in FF14 sort of comes and goes throughout the entire narrative. This may have something to do with the nature of Japanese storytelling and culture, and there may even be some language translation stuff in there as well. These things are almost bound to crop up, but I wanted to mention it either way. As I said in the previous video, I don't think the build-up to Stormblood is quite as bad as I once thought, but I still find the build-up to Heavensward was generally handled better. This mainly comes down to a difference in the amount of time spent establishing plot elements that continue directly into the next expansion, as well as a difference in foreshadowing. A Realm Reborn contained a lot of quests and cutscenes that introduced story elements that remained relevant and were expanded upon in Heavensward. For Stormblood we get something similar, but to a much lesser extent. The idea of liberating Alamigo is something that's cropped up now and then, but it's never really been the primary focus. Even in the 3.4 patch, the Alamigo stuff is intertwined with the Warriors of Darkness and Titan/Garbu, both of which have absolutely nothing to do with Stormblood, and make up the vast majority of that patch. It's only in 3.5 where things are really brought to the fore, with the introduction of Gosetsu, and particularly Ilberd summoning Shinryu, which essentially paves the way for the liberation effort to begin in earnest. The Garlean Empire are the main antagonists in Stormblood, but they are almost completely absent in Heavensward. The only times they ever show up is briefly at the very end of 4.0, and even more briefly at the very end of 4.5, and Xenos just isn't here at all. Compare that to the way Nidhogg and the Dravanians are consistently brought up in the base game, or how Emmett Selk is given his fair share of screen time at the end of Stormblood, firmly establishing his presence and influence as we go into Shadowbringers. It's for all these reasons that I strongly believe there is less of a transition between Heavensward and Stormblood than a Realm Reborn and Heavensward. There absolutely is less of a transition in my eyes. I'm not saying Stormblood's story is dumped on us out of nowhere, but I feel some more foundations being laid would result in a better experience. The way Heavensward builds upon the foreshadowing introduced in A Realm Reborn and closes out those plot lines is very fulfilling, and there isn't much of that in the next expansion, which isn't really Stormblood's fault either. The blame lies more in Heavensward. To be clear, when I say closes out those plot lines, I mean the ones connected to Ishgard specifically, as opposed to the stuff with the Sultana. Finally, I think there should have been more voice acting in some key scenes, namely before and after Som Al, and especially on the way to Zenith. I also hate how Vidofnir physically gasps, just to bring that up again, but otherwise my additional complaints were all mentioned as I walked through the story. Heavensward is certainly not free of problems, but it is so much more memorable than A Realm Reborn that it's almost shocking. I feel that makes it easier to forgive or even gloss over these problems. Honestly, I think a large part of the FF14 community tends to gloss over the story's problems in general, but with ridiculous highs like these, can you really blame them? It is very easy to get swept up in the sheer grandeur on display, and I'll admit I find myself swept up in it as well. Facing off against King Thordan and his Knights 12 in the Singularity Reactor is just incredible, and there are so many other moments of obscene extravagance as well. Regardless, Heavensward is great. In the Hydaelyn Zodiac saga from 2.0 all the way to 6.0, Heavensward stands out as one of the better expansions for me, possibly even the best. Things get way too bloated past Stormblood in my opinion, and I appreciate the relatively condensed narrative on offer here. If I can be perfectly honest, I am a little biased towards it because it was where I really started to appreciate this game for what it was. I have very strong memories of my first playthrough, and it's an experience I look back on with great fondness. The key thing to take away here is how much of an improvement it is from the base game, because it really is massive. I love Heavensward, I think it's great, but as a follow-up to A Realm Reborn, it's amazing. The last thing I want to talk about, but certainly not the least, is the music. Now, I am of the opinion that FF14's story, and the game in general to a certain extent, is somewhat carried by its music. I mean, this game's soundtrack is nothing short of breathtaking, and it does wonders for the narrative's emotional impact. So with each entry I want to take some time to discuss it, and by that I mean list my favorite pieces. Honestly, I could sit here and talk about so many tracks from this expansion, but some of the standouts for me include pretty much every day and night theme for the major zones, with Painted Foothills and Painted Skies being my favorites. Traveling through the Dravanian Falllands with these pieces playing in the background is magical. I also love the themes that play in the Curthis Western Highlands, Against the Wind and Black and White, as well as those that play in the Churning Mists, Landlords and Skylords. The fact that 2 renditions of the same theme play out in the zone depending on the time of day is probably my favorite thing about this game. I also greatly enjoy the track Stone and Steel for those uplifting heroic moments. The strings on this piece are epic. Thordan's theme, Heroes, is brilliant, as well as the extreme version, Heroes Never Die. Then of course we have the main theme of the expansion, Dragon Song, an emotional ballad dedicated to the story of Shiva and Hraesvelgr that perfectly captures the emotions surrounding the Dragon Song War. And the alternate renditions of this song are some of the best pieces of music in this game, my absolute favorite being Misconception. Masayoshi Soken, Nobu Oimatsu, apologies if I mispronounced that, Susan Calloway, and everyone else who contributed have done a truly incredible job here. This soundtrack is magnificent. I gotta say, I had a lot of fun making this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching it just as much. I finished recording all the footage for Stormblood, so that video should hopefully arrive sometime soon. Either way, if you watched the previous entry on A Realm Reborn and have stuck around for this one, I do appreciate that. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, then you should hit the subscribe button. That's gonna be all from me, guys. Thank you for watching, and until next time, cheers.